zooming up to the front line. I've actually never seen Somali fighters so focused on what their objectives are.
Islamic militants have seized Mogadishu in Somalia and they're expanding control across the country. It's a prospect that terrifies the West. Somalia's Islamists are accused of harboring Al-Qaeda terrorists and of destabilizing the entire Horn of Africa. Somalia's neighbors are preparing for all-out war. The militants in Mogadishu, meanwhile, are bracing themselves to defend their Islamic revolution. Mogadishu is notorious for being one of the most dangerous cities on earth. Numerous Westerners have been killed here. We're travelling into the city with armed bodyguards. We've come to see whether life in Mogadishu has changed under the militants, known as the Union of Islamic Courts.
We're driving across what was the Green Line, the worst area of fighting in the city.
Mogadishu has been reduced to rubble by a 16-year cycle of conflict involving local warlords and sharp U-turns in American foreign policy. First, the Americans intervened but clashed with the warlords. Then after 9/11, they decided to hire some of them as bounty hunters chasing terror suspects. War-torn Mogadishu, Washington claimed, had become a haven for Al-Qaeda. By January this year, the residents of Mogadishu decided that they'd had enough and backed the Islamists to rise up and defeat the warlords.
This is one of the places in Mogadishu where a decisive battle took place between the US-backed warlords and the UIC forces. Fighting raged in the city between January and June when the UIC finally took control of the capital.
By then, Somalia's long civil war had claimed 500,000 lives. We arrived at Mogadishu's port. During the civil war, this was devastated by fighting, a focus for competing factions trying to control the country's economy. Now there is only one faction in charge, the Union of Islamic Courts, or UIC.
50 ships have been here in the last couple of months, and they're able to deal with about 100,000 bags of food every day.
The Islamists, backed by rich Somali businessmen, are trying to get the economy back on track.
It's run by the Islamic courts, and you think that they're operating very well to get the country's economy working, do you?
Yes, absolutely, 100%. That's very clear. There's not any doubt.
So as a result, the Islamic courts are very popular because presumably the price of food is going down.
Yeah, they are very popular.
Suddenly, we noticed a commotion at the dockside. Soldiers of the Shabab, Arabic for youth, were gathering. Shabab forces are hardliners, well-trained and fired up by religion. They form a 2,000-strong stormtrooper unit within the Islamic Courts army. We discovered that the Shabab had arrested a gang of pirates on the high seas.
These chaps with their heads bowed, looking rather sheepish, are the pirates. There are 8 of them. There was a firefight when the Islamic Court militias boarded the ship that was carrying charcoal to the Gulf. And they very smartly went after the pirates, boarded the ship, and brought them back to port.
The militants are keen to show that they're capable of establishing law and order by ending all forms of banditry.
This is a huge publicity coup for the Islamic Court forces. There were 60 acts of piracy off Somali waters last year, making it the worst place in the world for piracy.
Even leading officials from the Islamic courts had turned up to celebrate the arrests, including the security chief Yusuf Indade.
What penalty will these pirates face if found guilty at the court? The Sheikh says that the pirates will face punishment under Islamic Sharia law, and the penalty could include execution.
The Islamic courts are sending a message to the outside world.
Sheikh Sharif, who is officially the leader of the Islamic courts, declares the waters off Somalia safe. But he also says that he doesn't feel that the international community recognises the contribution brought to security by the Islamic courts in Somalia.
Winning against the warlords in Mogadishu may have been the easiest part of the job. Now the Islamic courts are under pressure to actually govern. We went to find out more about their attempts to make the city safe.
We've come to a police station in Hamawain, the historic centre of Mogadishu. Until now, the Islamic courts have been mainly focused on subduing anarchy, but the population really wants them to establish civic institutions and administration, and this police station is part of that.
The new police force is run by the Shabab militant forces.
This is OB.
Yes.
Right, this is the OB, the occurrence book, which every functioning police station should have. Most of the incidents are not criminal, but are civic in nature. People coming back to houses which they're claiming as their own, trying to get rid of squatters, or arguments over vehicles, or arguments over places of business. Has the number of violent crimes reduced over recent months? He says that the Islamic courts have executed 2 murderers, and this has clearly sent a message to the others, and he says that the number of violent crimes has reduced.
From the police station, we travelled to the centrepiece of the new Islamic regime in Mogadishu, the courts. They're run according to Sharia law, a system of justice that is often seen as barbaric by Western observers.
We're on our way to the Central Islamic Court in Mogadishu. It's been very difficult to gain access because there's a lot of distrust of Western journalists and how we'll represent Sharia law. But finally we've been able to get an invitation.
We arrived to find the place buzzing with activity.
Islamic Justice has speeded up its operations in the last few weeks. They've already handed out some executions and floggings and stoning sentences. The courtyard is full of people attending cases. The buildings are being painted and renovated. This is the first real justice system that has existed in Somalia for the last 16 years since the civil war started. Court cases were already in session around the complex of buildings. While it's true the courts can hand down harsh criminal punishments, we were surprised to find them more preoccupied by civil cases. At a central hall, we witnessed the appointment of dozens of new magistrates or qadis. One of the core issues in resolving the civil war in Somalia is the return of hundreds of thousands of properties that were looted during the fighting. And the Islamic courts have become popular because they have begun the process to return property to their rightful owners. And Sheikh Abdul Qadir is lecturing the magistrates on how they must conduct those cases.
We crossed the courtyard to observe an appeal case hearing. This unusual dispute was about a man who had stabbed his wife. Sentence was that he should pay her family 5 camels, or the equivalent in cash, and the magistrates were now hearing his appeal.
The man is in jail meanwhile, and the wife, who suffered internal injuries, is not going to get whatever compensation money is paid. It's going to go to her family, and she meanwhile has agreed to go back to him after he's released.
This may not look like a court in Britain, but it appeared due legal process was being followed. The Islamists have restored order in Mogadishu, even marshalling armies of workers to clear decades of rubble from the streets. It's hard to believe that the rest of the world regards them as rebels. Somalia's recognised government is 250 kilometres away, holed up in the small farming town of Baidoa. It's supported by the international community, including the United Nations and the USA.
We are the only two Westerners in Mogadishu, apart from 3 European nuns. There are no aid workers, there are no diplomats, there's absolutely nobody from the Western world here.
Viva Islamic courses.
Yeah?
Viva.
You Viva Islamic courts?
Yes.
You like them?
Yes.
Yeah? Because it creates stability, does it?
We support Islamic courses.
International concern about the Union of Islamic Courts includes fears that they will be like the Taliban, seeking to control every aspect of life and basic freedoms. Some extremists have already clamped down on cinemas, music, and even watching World Cup football on TV. We visited a school to see if the curriculum was being tampered with. We were surprised to find many students were newly arrived from overseas. A lot of the children in this class are from the diaspora of Somalis who've returned from Britain, Canada and the US. The teachers comment that they come back with rather weak mathematics from Britain. And where have you come from?
England.
And where were you living in England?
Stratton.
Are you happy to be back here in Mogadishu?
Yes, it's a good country. And it's got good schools.
I wanted to know if the headmaster was coming under pressure from the Islamic courts. You have an Arabic curriculum with some elements of the Kenyan curriculum. Do you think that under the Islamic courts it will become a more Islamist curriculum?
Their main occupation now is to defend the country from enemies. So now they don't have time to focus on education or like that. So their main priority is keeping the peace.
So there is no input or influence from the Islamic courts at this stage?
No, none at all. But one thing certain is that almost all Somalis, including the students, are very happy with the work accomplished by the courts.
Mohammed, and where were you living? In Leicester. And how do you like it in comparison? Do you prefer it in Mogadishu?
No, I prefer it back in Leicester.
You prefer it back in Leicester. As we continued our tour of Islamic-controlled Mogadishu, we came across a demonstration. It turned out the building was a bank, Al Barakat, and the demonstrators had lost their deposits when its assets were frozen by the Americans after 9/11.
maalinkaas noloshayda hadda sida hadda iga muuqatay maalinkaas ninka nolol fiican baan ahay boqolkiiba boqol haddana.
This man said that he did well when he was relying on a stipend from Barakat, as did thousands of others, including orphans and the poor. And he is here together with other disabled people to protest the decision of the United States government and to request a lifting of the ban. Inside, we found more angry people.
It's a crime against humanity. It's a crime against Somali people. Is it fair, the biggest nation, to take over the poorest nation? This is a contradiction against human rights, because millions of Somalis suffer because of that action.
In 2001, Al Barakat had been accused by the Americans of being one of Al-Qaeda's personal bankers. Since then, the 9/11 Commission has cleared it of terrorist links, but the assets are still frozen, and the bank's director, Ahmed Jumali, is still a marked man.
Are you still on a terrorism watch list?
Yes, despite the 9/11 Commission report and the investigation conducted by the FBI in 2002.
The US says that part of the war on terror is winning hearts and minds in the Muslim world. Do you think that the US has made some enemies in Somalia as a result of the losses at Barakat?
I personally was a friend of US. I was educated by the Peace Corps of the US, but after the freeze and listing of our names in that terror list, it added to the hatred, and it fueled the hatred of the US.
despite all the positive things we'd seen in Mogadishu, the rebuilding, the new system of law and order, we also came across signs that some of the concerns about the Islamic courts were justified. We'd been told of foreign jihadis and secret camps. We were constantly warned that Shabab extremists might assassinate us because we were Christians.
We've been given this jihadi video. Many of them are locally produced, they're poor quality, and they're a call to arms and also a call for fundraising. Here you see images and the voice of Osama bin Laden describing Somalia as being in the front line of the global al-Qaeda jihad. The West has accused the UIC of harbouring terrorists involved in acts around the region of Eastern Africa. Of course, it's impossible for us to establish whether that is true, but this video, apart from including the images of Osama bin Laden and other al-Qaeda leaders, also celebrates some of the leaders of the UIC and their acts in this war against all of their rivals. We've been invited to interview Sheikh Hassan Dahir Awais, who is the most influential leader in the Islamic revolution taking place in Somalia. He's chairman of the Shura Council, and he's also the ideological leader for Shabab and the militant Islamic forces. It's alleged that you are harbouring 3 terrorists linked with the 1998 US embassy bombings in East Africa, and that members of the Islamic courts have been linked to murders of aid workers and other terrorist acts.
anigana waxay ugu daninayeen inaan dawladda islaam inaan dhiso rabo.
The Sheikh says that he knows that the United States doesn't want the Islamic courts to install an Islamic government in Somalia, and so they make up these allegations of terrorism links, for which he says they have no evidence. Do you think that you'll become more moderate? Or will you have more power to install the kinds of reforms that people say they feel might become like a Taliban-style government in Somalia?
haddii ay u jeedaan baalki muxuu ahaa qonyar socodka ama modernismka haddii u jeedaan qaabka reer galbeed.
Awais says that they will pursue an Islamic system, but at the same time take what is good from the West in terms of moderation.
Not everything.
We heard that crowds were gathering at the airport to greet some very important guests. The Islamists have spread control across a swathe of Somalia, but despite trying to unify people under the banner of religion, clan rivalries still divide the Somalis. This has brought them to the brink of war with the internationally recognised government. Now, suddenly, members of that government had flown in. The Islamic courts were hoping they'd come to join them. The Islamic courts are riding on a wave of popularity in Somalia today. Meanwhile, the government in Baidoa is collapsing in on itself. Here, the Speaker of Parliament is officially trying to save the peace talks, but some say that he's here to defect to the Islamic court side. Sheikh Adaw, the Islamic court's foreign secretary, was delighted to see them.
You're obviously quite excited. There were very euphoric scenes of like a reunion.
We are always excited for Somalis to come and join. The Islamic courts have pacified Mogadishu as well as the other areas under its authority. And we are appealing to all Somalis to come, to return regardless of their political position.
As it turned out, the speaker was only there to push a peace plan. Talks have all but broken down, and now war is looming between the forces in Mogadishu and the official government. And that's drawn neighbouring Ethiopia into the battle over the future of Somalia. The Ethiopians have massive troop numbers, aircraft and heavy weapons. They've declared war on the Islamic courts, who are now rallying support for jihad, or holy war.
It's quite an electrifying, wild atmosphere in Mogadishu at the moment. All the time there are groups going off to the front line. They're not armed with anything more than their devotion to Islam and a few machine guns.
Hatreds between Muslim Somalia and Christian-led Ethiopia go back centuries. A fresh clash of civilizations now threatens to engulf the Horn of Africa.
the Islamic court militias have had the power to mobilize Somalis in a very effective way because they can appeal to their sense of nationalism because Ethiopian soldiers are on Somali soil. And that, mixed together with the militant Islam that has restored law and order to Mogadishu, makes for a very potent mix.
Some of the fighters being thrown into the Holy War are so elderly that they wouldn't look out of place on the set of Dad's army.
These are old veteran soldiers from a government that fell 16 years ago, and they're being thrown into the jihad again to help the Islamic court forces. You're an elderly man. Why are you in uniform going off to fight? This man says he put on his uniform to defend Somali nationalism. He was in the war against Ethiopia that took place in 1977, and he says that he's going back to fight against the Ethiopians to defend his people and his religion and his country.
We were taken up to the front line where the Islamic forces are squaring up to the government and the Ethiopian army. We were the first Western journalists allowed to travel up to this front. Many of the Islamic fighters, Shabab extremists, were angry to see us Westerners in their midst. But luckily, we were with Abu Mansour, a Shabab leader.
Yeah, that's right. That's your son, isn't it, Abu Mansour? He's a 12-year-old boy. What's he doing here?
Abu Mansour says that his two sons came to the front line for jihad, fulfilling a wish he had when they were born.
Abu Mansour says that they will achieve an Islamic state. They will be ruled by the Quran. And even if the Americans destroy the words of the printed Quran, they are imprinted on the hearts of the Muslims, such as his son Mansour. All of these are the young Shabab militias. We're right on the front line. This is an anti-aircraft gun. We're well within range of the Ethiopian-backed government forces. I've actually never seen Somali fighters so focused on what their objectives are.
Back in Mogadishu, for the first time in their lives, these kids are enjoying peace. But that might be short-lived as war and famine loom again. Why? The West refuses to engage with the Islamists despite their control of the capital. It has sided with the Ethiopian-backed government instead. Already, fighting has broken out on the front lines.
Today, in this post-9/11 world, there's an Islamic revolution taking place here in Mogadishu. It was the Islamic courts, not the Americans or the United Nations, that ended the anarchy and began to re-establish the economy. But now Somalia sits at a crossroads, and there are fears of a fresh, terrible regional conflict, and also of the more extreme elements in the Islamic courts wanting to export jihad.
Abo waitiri abaya niri